Hey there, it's time for another Ask Me Anything session where I am answering all your questions about how to write a better book and how to go about getting published. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, and also go down into the link in my description below to download my free story self-assessment if you have a current work in progress. It's going to help you see it with fresh eyes, identify its strengths and weaknesses, and take it to the next level with revision. It's also going to sign you up for my newsletter that I am working hard on for you with exclusive tips and resources. Without further ado, let's dive in. We have some great questions today. The first question is, should I ask people's permission to include them in my acknowledgments section before I decide to self-publish my book? I'm grateful for so many people in my life. First, it is so kind of you to include that in acknowledgments page. I'm sure that anyone who is mentioned there will feel very appreciative and grateful that you chose to do that. In the traditional publishing industry, it is typical for an author to include an acknowledgments page at the very end of the book. And in my experience, they didn't necessarily ask for permission to include those people's names. It often included the editor at the publishing house, sometimes the editorial director or the publisher at the publishing house, as well as usually the author's literary agent, and then their personal friends and family who played a role in their book writing journey. In the case of asking the editors and the literary agents that they worked with, that wasn't necessarily typical. But when it comes to your own process, because you are self-publishing, it's completely up to you. If you would feel more comfortable asking people if they feel comfortable being acknowledged, then I would say go right ahead and do so. No harm done there. I'm sure that they're just going to be really grateful that you thought of them. But in terms of an industry standard, there really isn't necessarily one. Here's another question. I've heard so much doom and gloom recently that it's more difficult to query than ever, that traditional publishing is dying, that writers should forget about traditional and just self-publish. How much of the negativity is true, and is there hope for someone wanting to go the traditional route? I've talked about this a little bit. I actually made a whole video on if traditional publishing is dead or not, kind of when all of this started heating up on Twitter earlier in 2022. So definitely go and check out that video for a more in-depth overview of my interpretation of the current situation. But to give you a spoiler alert, I do not think traditional publishing is dead, and I absolutely would encourage you to continue with your querying journey if you feel passionately that you want to traditionally publish your book. The truth is that the publishing industry has always been tumultuous. Yes, right now is a particularly tough time. There are people leaving the industry, and therefore there are gaps on the editorial teams, therefore making everyone more overworked. Everyone is already notoriously underpaid. Literary agents are overwhelmed with queries and they don't have as many editors to send them to. So yes, there is a flurry of things going on in the industry right now. But at the end of the day, publishers are big corporations and they are still going to be putting out books, and they are still looking for book deals to make because that's how they make a profit. What I've seen more and more in the recent months on Twitter, where I follow a lot of industry professionals, is that agents are still very actively reviewing their queries. I see agents post every day about getting back to their queries or how many queries they've gone through, or that they're opening back up for queries, for instance. So to me, it really does seem like agents are eager to take on new clients. Of course, because of the status of the industry, it's possible that it might take longer than typical for a book deal to get made from the point of signing on with an agent, but that's out of your control, and to be quite honest, that was always out of your control anyway. Don't let the shakeups in the industry deter you. It's good that you're aware of them, but there's no reason to give up before you have even tried. Here's another question. Do you think we will ever see a book take off like so many books did years ago? I know lots of people hate 50 Shades, but people can't deny that the book sold so many copies that Barnes & Noble actually gave their employees bonuses, or so I've heard. But I haven't heard of a book standalone or series taking the world by storm in years, like Potter, Twilight, Hunger Games, 50 Shades, and after. Yeah, books go viral today, but nothing like the explosion of popularity of 10 or 15 years ago. I totally get what you're saying in that in recent years, there hasn't been a single series or a single title that it feels like everyone is reading all at the same time. I think it comes down to there being more books being published across the board in different genres. There's wider access to all different types of books, especially with self-publishing and the availability of self-published books alongside traditionally published books. So I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing that there are fewer instances of everyone all reading the same book. There are absolutely still blockbuster bestsellers, books being made into movies, and especially now with the rise of TikTok, there's a lot of books going TikTok viral and generating a lot of sales that way. So I do agree that the book industry maybe looks a little bit different than what it did 10, 15, 20 years ago, but I don't necessarily mean it's a change for the worse. The publishing industry is definitely still robust, and most, if not all, of the big 5 publishing houses in the US actually reported record sales in the past year. Here's another question. I wrote a family-friendly book, not YA, not adult. Adult protagonist and children characters. It's kind of like a fantasy version of Sound of Music. I'm querying but have no idea how to find an agent willing to take on this non-specific target age. When it comes to determining the age classification for your book, it's important to look at your protagonist and the main storyline that you follow. You mentioned that you have an adult protagonist, which would lead me to believe that the novel is best suited for adult, because typically in YA, the protagonist would be anywhere from 12 to 18 years old. Just because the book doesn't necessarily contain explicit language or maybe adult type content, it doesn't mean it's not adult or appealing to adults. If you had said the reverse and that the children characters are the protagonists and the adults are present in the story but they are secondary characters or we don't follow their points of view, then it might be the case that it would suit better as YA or even middle grade. But I would encourage you to separate the idea that adult novels can't be family friendly. Certainly, there are plenty of novels that don't contain anything that is necessarily inappropriate for children, but they're still targeted towards adults and featuring adult main characters. Here's the next question. How do you provide context of the era in a historical novel without info dumping? This is a really great and important question because info dumping or providing a lot of exposition, especially in the initial chapters, can be an easy way to make the reader disengage with the story, which is of course, the last thing that you want. So my advice here is actually not specific to a historical novel. It can be any novel where you need to provide a large amount of exposition, whether that be historical or sci-fi or fantasy, or anything else where you need to explain a certain context for the reader to register what's going on. And that is to always frame the expository or background information in the character's individual experience. So go ahead and kickstart the plot action, show that character engaging with their world, and as they're engaging with different elements of their world, use that as the opportunity to then explain or expand on something to the reader. I'm talking about 2 to 4 sentences, a paragraph's worth of information to explain what just happened or what they just encountered before going back into the scene action. This way, you're going to sprinkle the expository information in, and it's not going to be disruptive to the narrative like it can be when you just provide a huge amount of exposition or information in paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs all at once. What that does is it takes us out of the narrative and can really disrupt the narrative flow that you have established. So keep us following the character, experiencing the world alongside them. Remember that your reader is also going to put things together as they see that character interact with their world, but use moments in the character's experience, such as if they see a newspaper or if they encounter someone of a specific profession. Use those moments to then provide in the narration that background context that allows the reader to then make sense of the world that you've created. I hope you found these questions interesting today. If you have any of your own questions, leave them in a comment here and I will add them to my queue. As I mentioned, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me continue to bring you these videos and lets me know I'm bringing you content that you find helpful. And remember to grab that free story self-assessment if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.